Hey guys, welcome back to the channel Jama Nahi Yar. So let's continue Sophie's world, the cynics. The story goes that one day Socrates stood gazing at a stall that sold all kinds of wares. Finally he said, "What a lot of things I don't need." This statement could be the motto for the Cynic school of philosophy. Founded by Antisthenes in Athens around 400 BC. Antisthenes had been a pupil of Socrates, and had become particularly interested in his frugality. The Cynics emphasized that true happiness is not found in external advantages such as material luxury, political power, or good health. True happiness lies in not being dependent on such random and fleeting things. And because happiness does not consist in benefits of this kind, it is within everyone's reach. Moreover, having once been attained, it can never be lost. The best known of the Cynics was Diogenes, a pupil of Antisthenes, who reputedly lived in a barrel and owned nothing but a cloak, a stick, and a bread bag. So it wasn't easy to steal his happiness from him. One day while he was sitting beside his barrel enjoying the sun, he was visited by Alexander the Great. The emperor stood before him and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Was there anything he desired? Yes, Diogenes replied. Stand to one side. You're blocking the sun. Thus Diogenes showed that he was no less happy and rich than the great man before him. He had everything he desired. The Cynics believed that people did not need to be concerned about their own health. Even suffering and death should not disturb them. Nor should they let themselves be tormented by concern for other people's woes. Nowadays, the terms cynical and cynicism have come to mean a sneering disbelief in human sincerity, and they imply insensitivity to other people's suffering. The Stoics. The Cynics were instrumental in the development of the Stoic school of philosophy, which grew up in Athens around 300 BC. Its founder was Zeno, who came originally from Cyprus and joined the Cynics in Athens after being shipwrecked. He used to gather his followers under a portico. The name Stoic comes from the Greek word for portico, stu. Stoicism was later to have great significance for Roman culture. Like Heraclitus, the Stoics believed that everyone was a part of the same common sense, or logos. They thought that each person was like a world in miniature, or microcosmos, which is a reflection of the macrocosmos. This led to the thought that there exists a universal rightness, the so-called natural law. And because this natural law was based on timeless human and universal reason, it did not alter with time and place. In this, then, the Stoics sided with Socrates against the Sophists. Natural law governed all mankind, even slaves. The Stoics considered the legal statutes of the various states merely as incomplete imitations of the law embedded in nature itself. In the same way that the Stoics erased the difference between the individual and the universe, they also denied any conflict between spirit and matter. There is only one nature, they averred. This kind of idea is called monism, in contrast to Plato's clear dualism or twofold reality. As true children of their time, the Stoics were distinctly cosmopolitan, in that they were more receptive to contemporary culture than the barrel philosophers, the Cynics. They drew attention to human fellowship, they were preoccupied with politics, and many of them, notably the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, AD 121 to 180, were active statesmen. They encouraged Greek culture and philosophy in Rome, one of the most distinguished of them being the orator, philosopher, and statesman Cicero. 106 to 43 BC, it was he who formed the very concept of humanism, that is, a view of life that has the individual as its central focus. Some years later, the Stoic Seneca, for B.ca.d 65, said that to mankind is holy. This has remained a slogan for humanism ever since. The Stoics, moreover, emphasized that all natural processes, such as sickness and death, follow the unbreakable laws of nature. Man must therefore learn to accept his destiny. Nothing happens accidentally. Everything happens through necessity, so it is of little use to complain when fate comes knocking at the door. One must also accept the happy events of life unperturbed, they thought. In this we see their kinship with the Cynics, who claimed that all external events were unimportant. Even today we use the term stoic calm about someone who does not let his feelings take over. The Epicureans. As we have seen, Socrates was concerned with finding out how man could live a good life. Both the Cynics and the Stoics interpreted his philosophy as meaning that man had to free himself from material luxuries, but Socrates also had a pupil named Aristippus. He believed that the aim of life was to attain the highest possible sensory enjoyment. The highest good is pleasure, he said, the greatest evil is pain. So he wished to develop a way of life whose aim was to avoid pain in all forms. The Cynics and the Stoics believed in enduring pain of all kinds, which is not the same as setting out to avoid pain. Around the year 300 BC, Epicurus, 341 to 270, founded a school of philosophy in Athens. His followers were called Epicureans. He developed the pleasure ethic of Aristippus and combined it with the atom theory of Democritus. The story goes that the Epicureans lived in a garden. They were therefore known as the garden philosophers. Above the entrance to this garden there is said to have hung a notice saying, "Stranger, here you will live." Well, here pleasure is the highest good. Epicurus emphasized that the pleasurable results of an action must always be weighed against its possible side effects. If you have ever binged on chocolate, you know what I mean. If you haven't, try this exercise, take all your saved up pocket money and buy 200 crowns worth of chocolate. We'll assume you like chocolate. It is essential to this exercise that you eat it all at one time. About half an hour later, when all that delicious chocolate is eaten, you will understand what Epicurus meant by side effects. Epicurus also believed that a pleasurable result in the short term must be weighed against the possibility of a greater, more lasting, or more intense pleasure in the long term. Maybe you abstain from eating chocolate for a whole year because you prefer to save up all your pocket money and buy a new bike or go on an expensive vacation abroad. Unlike animals, we are able to plan our lives. We have the ability to make a pleasure calculation. Chocolate is good, but a new bike or a trip to England is better. Epicurus emphasized, though, that pleasure does not necessarily mean sensual pleasure, like eating chocolate, for instance. Values such as friendship and the appreciation of art also count. Moreover, the enjoyment of life required the old Greek ideals of self-control, temperance, and serenity. Desire must be curbed, and serenity will help us to endure pain. Fear of the gods brought many people to the garden of Epicurus. In this connection, the atom theory of Democritus was a useful cure for religious superstitions. In order to live a good life, it is not unimportant to overcome the fear of death. To this end, Epicurus made use of Democritus's theory of the soul atoms. You may perhaps remember that Democritus believed there was no life after death, because when we die, the soul atoms disperse in all directions. Death does not concern us, Epicurus said quite simply, because as long as we exist, death is not here. And when it does come, we no longer exist. When you think about it, no one has ever been bothered by being dead. Epicurus summed up his liberating philosophy with what he called the four medicinal herbs. The gods are not to be feared. Death is nothing to worry about. good is easy to attain. The fearful is easy to endure. From a Greek point of view, there was nothing new in comparing philosophical projects with those of medical science. The intention was simply that man should equip himself with a philosophic medicine chest containing the 4 ingredients I mentioned. In contrast to the Stoics, the Epicureans showed little or no interest in politics and the community. Live in seclusion was the advice of Epicurus. We could perhaps compare his garden with our present-day communes. There are many people in our own time who have sought a safe harbor away from society. After Epicurus, many Epicureans developed an overemphasis on self-indulgence. Their motto was "live for the moment." The word Epicurean is used in a negative sense nowadays to describe someone who lives only for pleasure. Neoplatonism. As I showed you, Cynicism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism all had their roots in the teaching of Socrates. They also made use of certain of the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus and Democritus. But the most remarkable philosophic trend in the late Hellenistic period was first and foremost inspired by Plato's philosophy. We therefore call it Neoplatonism. The most important figure in Neoplatonism was Plotinus, c. 205–270, who studied philosophy in Alexandria but later settled in Rome. It is interesting to note that he came from Alexandria, the city that had been the central point for Greek philosophy and Oriental mysticism for several centuries. Plotinus brought with him to Rome a doctrine of salvation that was to compete seriously with Christianity when its time came. However, Neoplatonism also became a strong influence in mainstream Christian theology as well. Remember Plato's doctrine of ideas, Sophie, and the way he distinguished between the world of ideas and the sensory world. This meant establishing a clear division between the soul and the body. Man thus became a dual creature. Our body consisted of earth and dust like everything else in the sensory world, but we also had an immortal soul. This was widely believed by many Greeks long before Plato. Plotinus was also familiar with similar ideas from Asia. Plotinus believed that the world is a span between 2 poles. At one end is the divine light, which he calls the One. Sometimes he calls it God. At the other end is absolute darkness, which receives none of the light from the One. But Plotinus's point is that this darkness actually has no existence. It is simply the absence of light. In other words, it is not all that exists is God, or the One, but in the same way that a beam of light grows progressively dimmer and is gradually extinguished, there is somewhere a point that the divine glow cannot reach. According to Plotinus, the soul is illuminated by the light from the One, while matter is the darkness that has no real existence. But the forms in nature have a faint glow of the One. Imagine a great burning bonfire in the night from which sparks fly in all directions. A wide radius of light from the bonfire turns night into day in the immediate area, but the glow from the fire is visible even from a distance of several miles. If we went even further away, we would be able to see a tiny speck of light like a far-off lantern in the dark, and if we went on moving away, at some point the light would not reach us. Somewhere the rays of light disappear into the night, and when it is completely dark, we see nothing. There are neither shapes nor shadows. Imagine now that reality is a bonfire like this. That which is burning is God, and the darkness beyond is the cold matter that man and animals are made of. Closest to God are the eternal ideas, which are the primal forms of all creatures. The human soul, above all, is a spark from the fire. Yet, everywhere in nature, some of the divine light is shining. We can see it in all living creatures. Even a rose or a bluebell has its divine glow. Furthest away from the living God are earth and water and stone. I am saying that there is something of the divine mystery in everything that exists. We can see it sparkle in a sunflower or a poppy. We sense more of this unfathomable mystery in a butterfly that flutters from a twig or in a goldfish swimming in a bowl. But we are closest to God in our own soul. Only there can we become one with the great mystery of life. In truth, at very rare moments we can experience that we ourselves are that divine mystery. Plotinus's metaphor is rather like Plato's myth of the cave. The closer we get to the mouth of the cave, the closer we get to that which all existence springs from. But in contrast to Plato's clear twofold reality, Plotinus's doctrine is characterized by an experience of wholeness. Everything is one. For everything is God. Even the shadows deep down in Plato's cave have a faint glow of the one. On rare occasions in his life, Plotinus experienced a fusion of his soul with God. We usually call this a mystical experience. Plotinus is not alone in having had such experiences. People have told of them at all times and in all cultures. The details might be different, but the essential features are the same. Let us take a look at some of these features. Mysticism. A mystical experience is an experience of merging with God or the cosmic spirit. Many religions emphasize the gulf between God and creation. But the mystic experiences no such gulf. He or she has experienced being one with God or merging with Him. The idea is that what we usually call I is not the true I. In short, glimpses we can experience an identification with a greater I. Some mystics call it God, others call it the cosmic spirit, nature, or the universe. When the fusion happens, the mystic feels that he is losing himself, he disappears into God or is lost in God in the same way that a drop of water loses itself when it merges with the sea. An Indian mystic once expressed it in this way: when I was, God was not. When God is, I am no more. The Christian mystic Angelus Silesius, 1624–1677, put it another way: every drop becomes the sea when it flows oceanward, just as at last the soul ascends, and thus becomes the Lord. Now you might feel that it cannot be particularly pleasant to lose oneself. I know what you mean. But the point is that what you lose is so very much less than what you gain. You lose yourself only in the form you have at the moment, but at the same time you realize that you are something much bigger. You are the universe. In fact, you are the cosmic spirit itself, Sophie. It is you who are God. If you have to lose yourself as Sophie Amundsen, you can take comfort in the knowledge that this everyday I is something you will lose one day anyway. Your real I, which you can only experience if you are able to lose yourself, is, according to the mystics, like a mysterious fire that goes on burning to all eternity. But a mystical experience like this does not always come of itself. The mystic may have to seek the path of purification and enlightenment to his meeting with God. This path consists of the simple life and various meditation techniques. Then all at once the mystic achieves his goal, and can exclaim, I am God, or I am you. Mystical trends are found in all the great world religions. And the descriptions of mystical experiences given by the mystics show a remarkable similarity across all cultural boundaries. It is in the mystics' attempt to provide a religious or philosophic interpretation of the mystical experience that his cultural background reveals itself. In Western mysticism, that is, within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the mystic emphasizes that his meeting is with a personal God. Although God is present both in nature and in the human soul, he is also far above and beyond the world. In Eastern mysticism, that is, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Chinese religion, it is more usual to emphasize that the mystic experiences a total fusion with God or the cosmic spirit. I am the cosmic spirit, the mystic can exclaim, or I am God. For God is not only present in the world, he has nowhere else to be. In India, especially, there have been strong mystical movements since long before the time of Plato. Swami Vivekananda, an Indian who was instrumental in bringing Hinduism to the West, once said, just as certain world religions say that people who do not believe in a personal God outside themselves are atheists, we say that a person who does not believe in himself is an atheist. Not believing in the splendor of one's own soul is what we call atheism. A mystical experience can also have ethical significance. A former President of India, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, said once, "Love thy neighbor as thyself, because you or your neighbor." It is an illusion that makes you think that your neighbor is someone other than yourself. People of our own time who do not adhere to a particular religion also tell of mystical experiences. They have suddenly experienced something they have called cosmic consciousness or an oceanic feeling. They have felt themselves wrenched out of time and have experienced the world from the perspective of eternity. Sophie sat up in bed. She had to feel whether she still had a body. As she read more and more about Plato and the mystics, she had begun to feel as though she were floating around in the room, out of the window, and far off above the town. From there, she had looked down on all the people in the square, and had floated on and on over the globe that was her home, over the North Sea and Europe, down over the Sahara, and across the African savanna. The whole world had become almost like a living person, and it felt as if that person were Sophie herself. The world is me, she thought. The great big universe that she had often felt to be unfathomable and terrifying, was her own I. Now, too, the universe was enormous and majestic, but now it was herself who was so big. The extraordinary feeling was fleeting, but Sophie was sure she would never forget it. It felt as if something inside her had burst through her forehead and become merged with everything else, the way a drop of color can tint a whole jug of water. When it was all over, it was like waking up with a headache after a wonderful dream. Sophie registered with a touch of disillusionment that she had a body which was trying to sit up in bed, lying on her stomach reading the pages from Alberto. Knox had given her a backache. But she had experienced something unforgettable. Eventually, she pulled herself together and stood up. The first thing she did was to punch holes in the pages and file them in her ring binder together with the other lessons. Then she went into the garden. The birds were singing as if the world had just been born. The pale green of the birches behind the old rabbit hutches was so intense that it seemed as though the creator had not yet finished blending the color. Could she really believe that everything was one divine eye? Could she believe that she carried within her a soul that was a spark from the fire? If it was true, then she was truly a divine creature. The postcards. I'm imposing a severe censorship on myself. Several days went by without any word from the philosophy teacher. Tomorrow was Thursday, May 17th, Norway's National Day. School would be closed on the 18th. As well, as they walked home after school, Joanna suddenly exclaimed, "Let's go camping." Sophie's immediate reaction was that she couldn't be away from the house for long. But then she said, "Sure, why not?" A couple of hours later, Joanna arrived at Sophie's door with a large backpack. Sophie had packed hers as well, and she also had the tent. They both had bedrolls and sweaters, ground sheets and flashlights, large-sized thermos bottles, and plenty of their favorite food. When Sophie's mother got home around 5 o'clock, she gave them a sermon about what they must and must not do. She also insisted on knowing where they were going to set up camp. They told her they intended to make for Grouse Top. They might be lucky enough to hear the mating call of the grouse next morning. Sophie had an ulterior motive for choosing that particular spot. She thought that Grouse Top must be pretty close to the Major's cabin. Something was urging her to return to it, but she didn't dare go alone. The two girls walked down the path that led from the little cul-de-sac just beyond Sophie's garden gate. They chatted about this and that, and Sophie enjoyed taking a little time off from everything having to do with philosophy. By 8 o'clock, they had pitched their tent in a clearing by Grouse Top. They had prepared themselves for the night and their bedrolls were unfolded. When they had eaten their sandwiches, Sophie asked, "Have you ever heard of the Major's cabin?" "The Major's cabin? There's a hut in the woods somewhere near here, by a little lake. A strange man lived there once, a major, that's why it's called the Major's cabin. Does anyone live there now? Do you want to go and see?" "Where is it?" Sophie pointed in among the trees. Joanna was not particularly eager, but in the end they set out. The sun was low in the sky. They walked in between the tall pine trees at first, but soon they were pushing their way through bush and thicket. Eventually, they made their way down to a path. Could it be the path Sophie had followed that Sunday morning? It must have been. Almost at once she could point to something shining between the trees, to the right of the path. "It's in there," she said. They were soon standing at the edge of the small lake. Sophie gazed at the cabin, crossed the water. All the windows were now shuttered up. The red building was the most deserted place she had seen for ages. Joanna turned toward her. "Do we have to walk on the water?" "Of course not. We'll row." Sophie pointed down into the reeds. There lay the rowboat, just as before. "Have you been here before?" Sophie shook her head. Trying to explain her previous visit would be far too complicated. And then she would have to tell her friend about Alberto Knox and the philosophy course as well. They laughed and joked as they rowed across the water. When they reached the opposite bank, Sophie made sure they drew the boat well up on land. They went to the front door. As there was obviously nobody in the cabin, Joanna tried the door handle. "Locked. You didn't expect it to be open, did you?" "Maybe we can find a key," said Sophie. She began to search in the crevices of the stonework foundation. "Oh, let's go back to the tent instead," said Joanna after a few minutes. But just then Sophie exclaimed, "Here it is. I found it." She held up the key triumphantly. She put it in the lock and the door swung open. The two friends sneaked inside as if they were up to something criminal. It was cold and dark in the cabin. "We can't see a thing," said Joanna. But Sophie had thought of that. She took a box of matches out of her pocket and struck one. They only had time to see that the cabin was deserted before the match went out. Sophie struck another, and this time she noticed a stump of candle in a wrought iron candlestick on top of the stove. She lit it with the third match and the little room became light enough for them to look around. "Isn't it odd that such a small candle can light up so much darkness?" said Sophie. Her friend nodded. "But somewhere the light disappears into the dark," Sophie went on. "Actually, darkness has no existence of its own. It's only a lack of light." Joanna shivered. "That's creepy. Come on, let's go." "Not before we've looked in the mirror." Sophie pointed to the brass mirror hanging above the chest of drawers, just as before. "That's really pretty," said Joanna. "But it's a magic mirror." "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" "I'm not kidding, Joanna. I am sure you can look in it and see something on the other side. Are you sure you've never been here before? And why is it so amusing to scare me all the time?" Sophie could not answer that one. "Sorry." Now it was Joanna who suddenly discovered something lying on the floor in the corner. It was a small box. Joanna picked it up. "Postcards," she said. Sophie gasped, "Don't touch them." Do you hear? Don't you dare touch them. Joanna jumped. She threw the box down as if she had burnt herself. The postcards were strewn all over the floor. The next second she began to laugh. They're only postcards. Joanna sat down on the floor and started to pick them up. After a while Sophie sat down beside her. Lebanon. 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 They are all postmarked in Lebanon. Joanna discovered. I know, said Sophie. Joanna sat bolt upright and looked Sophie in the eye. So you have been here before? Yes, I guess I have. It suddenly struck her that it would have been a whole lot easier if she had just admitted she had been here before. It couldn't do any harm if she let her friend in on the mysterious things she had experienced during the last few days. I didn't want to tell you before we were here. Joanna began to read the cards. They are all addressed to someone called Hilda Mollernag. Sophie had not touched the cards yet. What address? Joanna read, Hilda Mollernag, care of Alberto Knox, Lillesand, Norway. Sophie breathed a sigh of relief. She was afraid they would say care of Sophie Amundsen. She began to inspect them more closely. April 28th. May 4th. May 6th. May 9th. They were stamped a few days ago. But there's something else. All the postmarks are Norwegian. Look at that. UN Battalion, the stamps are Norwegian too. I think that's the way they do it. They have to be sort of neutral, so they have their own Norwegian post office down there. But how do they get the mail home? The Air Force, probably. Sophie put the candlestick on the floor, and the two friends began to read the cards. Joanna arranged them in chronological order and read the first card. Dear Hilda, I can't wait to come home to Lillesand. I expect to land at Kjevik Airport early evening on Midsummer Eve. I would much rather have arrived in time for your 15th birthday, but I'm under military command of course. To make up for it, I promise to devote all my loving care to the huge present you are getting for your birthday, with love from someone who is always thinking about his daughter's future. P.S. I'm sending a copy of this card to our mutual friend. I know you understand, Hilda. At the moment I'm being very secretive, but you will understand. Sophie picked up the next card. Dear Hilda, down here we take one day at a time. If there is one thing I'm going to remember from these months in Lebanon, it's all this waiting. But I'm doing what I can so you have as great a 15th birthday as possible. I can't say any more at the moment. I'm imposing a severe censorship on myself. Love, Dad. The two friends sat breathless with excitement. Neither of them spoke, they just read what was written on the cards. My dear child, what I would like best would be to send you my secret thoughts. With a white dove. But they are all out of white doves in Lebanon. If there is anything this war-torn country needs, it is white doves. I pray the UN will truly manage to make peace in the world someday. P.S. Maybe your birthday present can be shared with other people. Let's talk about that when I get home. But you still have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Love from someone who has plenty of time to think for the both of us. When they had read 6 cards, there was only one left. It read, Dear Hilda, I am now so bursting with all these secrets for your birthday that I have to stop myself several times a day from calling home and blowing the whole thing. It is something that simply grows and grows. And as you know, when a thing gets bigger and bigger, it's more difficult to keep it to yourself. Love from Dad. P.S. Someday you will meet a girl called Sophie. To give you both a chance to get to know more about each other before you meet, I have begun sending her copies of all the cards I send to you. I expect she will soon begin to catch on, Hilda. As yet, she knows no more than you. She has a girlfriend called Joanna. Maybe sight can be of help? After reading the last card, Joanna and Sophie sat quite still staring wildly at each other. Joanna was holding Sophie's wrist in a tight grip. "I'm scared," she said. "So am I. When was the last card stamped?" Sophie looked again at the card. "May 16th, she said. "That's today." "It can't be," cried Joanna, almost angrily. They examined the postmark carefully, but there was no mistaking it. 05-16-90. "It's impossible," insisted Joanna. "And I can't imagine who could have written it. It must be someone who knows us. But how could they know we would come here on this particular day?" Joanna was by far the more scared of the two. The business with Hilda and her father was nothing new to Sophie. "I think it has something to do with the brass mirror." Joanna jumped again. "You don't actually think the cards come fluttering out of the mirror the minute they are stamped in Lebanon? Do you have a better explanation?" "No." Sophie got to her feet and held the candle up in front of the two portraits on the wall. Joanna came over and peered at the pictures. "Berkeley and Björkley. What does that mean?" "I have no idea." The candle was almost burnt down. "Let's go," said Joanna. "Come on. We must just take the mirror with us." Sophie reached up and unhooked the large brass mirror from the wall above the chest of drawers. Joanna tried to stop her, but Sophie would not be deterred. When they got outside, it was as dark as a May night can get. There was enough light in the sky for the clear outlines of bushes and trees to be visible. The small lake lay like a reflection of the sky above it. The two girls rowed pensively across to the other side. Neither of them spoke much on the way back to the tent, but each knew that the other was thinking intensely about what they had seen. Now and then a frightened bird would start up, and a couple of times they heard the hooting of an owl. As soon as they reached the tent, they crawled into their bedrolls. Joanna refused to have the mirror inside the tent. Before they fell asleep, they agreed that it was scary enough, knowing it was just outside the tent flap. Sophie had also taken the postcards and put them in one of the pockets of her backpack. They woke early next morning. Sophie was up first. She put her boots on and went outside the tent. There lay the large mirror in the grass, covered with dew. Sophie wiped the dew off with her sweater and gazed down at her own reflection. It was as if she was looking down and up at herself at the same time. Luckily, she found no early morning postcard from Lebanon. Above the broad clearing behind the tent, a ragged morning mist was drifting slowly into little wads of cotton. Small birds were chirping energetically, but Sophie could neither see nor hear any grouse. The girls put on extra sweaters and ate their breakfast outside the tent. Their conversation soon turned to the Major's cabin and the mysterious cards. After breakfast, they folded up the tent and set off for home. Sophie carried the large mirror under her arm. From time to time she had to rest. Joanna refused to touch it. As they approached the outskirts of the town, they heard a few sporadic shots. Sophie recalled what Hilda's father had written about war-torn Lebanon, and she realized how lucky she was to have been born in a peaceful country. The shots they heard came from innocent fireworks celebrating the national holiday. Sophie invited Joanna in for a cup of hot chocolate. Her mother was very curious to know where they had found the mirror. Sophie told her they had found it outside the Major's cabin, and her mother repeated the story about nobody having lived there for many years. When Joanna had gone, Sophie put on a red dress. The rest of the Norwegian National Day passed quite normally. In the evening, the TV news had a feature on how the Norwegian UN battalion had celebrated the day in Lebanon. Sophie's eyes were glued to the screen. One of the men she was seeing could be Hilda's father. The last thing Sophie did on May 17th was to hang the large mirror on the wall in her room. The following morning, there was a new brown envelope in the den. She tore it open at once and began to read. So thank you for watching. We will continue Sophie's world in next video.